IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am Suyash Desai, an Associate Research Fellow at the China Studies Program at Takshashila Institution. In today's episodes of All Things Policy, we are discussing synthetic content generation using artificial intelligence and the Chinese government's recent draft to regulate such content. Recently, the Cyberspace Administration of China floated a draft of provisions on administrations of synthetically generated content using AI. The provisions have been framed under the cybersecurity law, data security law, personal information protection law, measures for administration of internet information services, and others. This draft and similarly other regulations issued last year indicate that Chinese authorities are worried about the applications of AI in digital platforms. To discuss more about this, we have our very own China Tech PLA AI military scholar, Megha Pardhi, a research analyst at Takshashila Institution. Megha studies the PLA, military tech, and China's defense and foreign policies. Hi, Megha.
Hi Suyash. Today we also have Varad Vishwarupe with us. Varad is data scientist at Amazon's research division. Prime focus of his work lies at confluence of deep learning, applied machine learning, and human-computer interaction and information retrieval. He has completed his post-graduation in computer science from Oxford University of Oxford. He has over 22 international research papers and 4 patents to his credit. He has previously worked at Microsoft IDC on Azure Machine Learning and interned at IBM Research Lab in Data Analytics Division. Welcome, Varad.
Hi, Megha. Thank you for the opportunity. Very glad to be a part of this podcast.
So, before we move on to China's regulation, I want to let our audience know what exactly is AI generated content or synthetic content generation using AI. Can you elaborate on that a little?
So, before going and progressing towards AI generated content, we should first be able to differentiate between and get to terms with what is AI, what is ML, and what is deep learning. So, in a nutshell, deep learning is basically an umbrella term. It is the subset of machine learning, and machine learning in itself is a subset of artificial intelligence. So, as you can understand, that artificial intelligence is anything that tries to mimic synthetic intelligence. It's an endeavor that is completely based on trying to make machines more intelligent. And machine learning is basically a subset of AI which is geared towards data mining and pattern recognition and all those things. Basically, something that learns from data. It is under the purview of machine learning. And deep learning is an even further subset of AI, I would say. And it's a subset of ML as well. So deep learning is that branch of machine learning which uses neural networks with many layers. So what's a neural network? Neural network is basically it's an interconnection of neurons which tries to mimic how the human brain actually works. And in doing so, we are basically trying to tell the machine or teach the machine to recognize and interpret as well as visualize data in a way that human brain does. Okay. So a deep neural network analyzes the data with learned representations similar to a way a person would look at a problem. Okay. So in traditional machine learning, the algorithm is given a set of relevant features to analyze. However, in deep learning, the algorithm is given raw data and it decides for itself what features are relevant. So in a way, you can say that it is probably the smartest form of learning or the smartest form of AI that is currently in use. And deep learning networks will often improve as you increase the amount of data that is being used to train them. And deep learning is essentially a branch of AI that closely tries to mimic how the human brain works. And when explaining to a system, I think just like humans learn from experience, a deep learning algorithm can perform a task repeatedly, each time tweaking it to improve the outcome. Okay. So the term deep learning actually refers to the neural networks having many layers that enable learning And deep learning is about the hidden layers that are comprised of a lot of, convolutional neural networks, recurrent neural networks, long short-term memory networks, generative adversarial networks. So these are probably the four most commonly used deep learning frameworks or deep learning algorithms in the world. Okay. So I can give you a very good analogy for people who are not actually well versed with the technical paraphernalia of machine learning. So how do we explain it to someone who is, a layman in these technologies or in these terms? So for decades, in order to get, computers to respond to our requests for information, we had to learn to speak to them in a way that they would understand. It often involved writing assembly language code. It often involved writing codes in Fortran and Pascal in the past. This meant that having to learn things like, for example, a Boolean query language, that we had to write complex rules that carefully instructed the computer what actions to take. Okay. Deep learning's arrival actually flips this in a way that now the computer tells us that you don't need to worry about carefully constructing your request ahead of time, which is known as programming in a nutshell, right? But what we have to rather do is that we provide the computers or the machines a definition of the desired outcome and an example set of inputs. So two things are fixed: what we want and what we have. And the deep learning algorithm will, in a way, it back propagates, and in a backward propagation kind of way, it will solve the answer to your questions. Okay. So it basically tries to decipher all the hidden meanings. It tries to decipher all the hidden paraphernalia on its own. And it is only concerned with the expected output and the input. One of the bottleneck with this is that we actually don't know what's happening in the hidden layers, but it is probably the smartest way of doing things currently, because the results that we get through deep learning, those are really, really promising. And to answer your second question, when it comes to content generation, so there are a plethora of fields where AI generated content is currently being used. I can give you some, you know, actual examples. There's one content generation tool called Articulu. So it's an automatic article generator. You just type in some keywords, you just type in some things that are required for your article, and it fetches information related to that article from the web, and it even cites things that are taken from a particular source, and then it completes the article. Second is Grammarly is also an AI based content generation system. It's not exactly content generation, but it's, I think, content rectification system, that whenever you use the Grammarly plugin on your Safari browser or probably Chrome or Firefox, it takes into account the context of your particular article. And based on the context, it tries to decipher the tone, the meaning, and the contextual reference of some words. And based on that, it gives you suggestions in real time. So, this is also a very good example of AI based content generation. And then the most rampant or the most common example is, I think, of Amazon and Flipkart and any such e-commerce sites, that whenever you browse for some products, you're always shown some related items, and that is actually based on a lot of machine learning algorithms, that based on your prior history, it's called feature extraction or feature identification or feature classification. So whenever a machine is trying to recommend you something, it actually takes into account your prior user history. It takes into account some features or some parameters which are currently very common or very much in vogue at that particular time. It might be a keyword. For example, if you're shopping something on the eve of Christmas, on Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve, you'll obviously be inclined to give preference to gifts rather than common articles or common items. So when you buy something, you'll obviously be shown something which is under the purview or the category of gifts or under the category of Christmas gifts. So this is how content generation takes place, and it is so commonplace, AI-based content generation, that the umbrella for it is very huge. It is all encompassing, from the fields of education to natural language processing, content generation through Grammarly, through Articlo and Wordsmith, and all such plethora of softwares. So this is what AI generation content is currently, and I think it has a very bright future in the long run. And I think I was able to summarize deep learning also. It's the most common algorithm that is currently used for training it in a way which mimics the human brain. So it is the closest to the working of any human brain. And then there are algorithms which I told you about. So I think that answers your query.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, this has been kind of a quick crash course to AI and ML for me. Yeah, so
Yeah.
now there's a term metaverse. It has been used so many times and, it's so in vogue, everybody's talking about it. So, even I want to talk about
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
So tell me, how can we use, how AI is used to build metaverse?
Yeah. Again, to understand metaverse, I think it is, to understand how AI is used to shape or conceptualize and run the metaverse, it is paramount to understand what is metaverse in its truest sense. I think this metaverse concept was, it was in vogue, but it received an impetus since the time I think Mark Zuckerberg announced about metaverse's arrival and how the Facebook company was renamed to Meta, and the sign was also changed to an infinity. So people have been very curious about the same. So when it comes to metaverse, so what does it exactly mean? So just you can for a second just replace the word metaverse with cyberspace. Cyberspace is something very analogous, and cyberspace is something which we all are acquainted with. So 90% of the time, metaverse is analogous or synonymous with cyberspace. That's because the term doesn't really refer to any one specific type of technology, but rather a broad shift in how we interact with technology. So, metaverse is definitely a creation of a lot of new technology or new content, but it is more about how we interact with the content rather than the exact type of content that is being created. Okay. And it's entirely possible that the term itself will eventually become just as antiquated as some of the technologies. So, broadly speaking, the technologies that make up the metaverse can include virtual reality. It is characterized by persistent virtual worlds that continue to exist even when you are not playing. Okay. So, for example, if there's a head mounted display, HMD, if there's a HMD, you're using that head mounted display to interact with that particular virtual reality environment. But after you keep that display aside, if you're not using it, it ceases to exist, right? There's no existence on its own. But in metaverse, that doesn't happen. Metaverse is the coexistence of a universe within the universe. So I think this is best definition that I can personally come up for the term or concept of metaverse. So it's the coexistence of a universe within the universe, which runs in tandem or in parallel with the current technology or the way you interact. However, it doesn't require that those spaces be exclusively accessed by VR or AR. A virtual world, like, for example, the aspects of Fortnite or Pokemon Go, that can be accessed through PCs, game consoles, and even phones. So those could be metaversal. So now, after getting a good idea of what is metaverse, we need to understand how AI plays a part. AI plays a part when it actually comes into the context of user interaction. So the first point or the first most important thing to address here is that AI should work in tandem with the metaverse, and secondly, it should not go overboard. Okay, so it's difficult to pass that. All this means when you hear descriptions like, wait, does it really exist, or is metaverse real? So metaverse is definitely real, but it is not real in a way that it mimics physical physical objects or physical technologies. But AI comes in the context of metaverse when we have to generate content. For example, I'll give you one more example when it comes to the coexistence of metaverse. If you're riding on your bike, for example, and you have some virtual reality goggles or HMD display, so what the AI should possibly do is it should give you a holistic overview of where you are going, what is happening, but at the same time, it should not distract you. Okay, not getting distracted from your physical surroundings is the first most important thing in the coexistence of any metaverse object or any metaverse technology. If it is actually being a bottleneck, then it is not conducive to the development of this field. So AI comes in the picture when it is used in tandem with the particular metaverse technologies. So in this regard, a lot of research is currently happening at the confluence of computer graphics, virtual reality, and human computer interaction also. So when it comes to shaping industrial practices, for example, now you might have, or your even the listeners might have encountered the term called industry 4.0. So Industry 4.0 is something very much in vogue. It is currently being discussed. And I published a couple of papers, and one of them was in Germany and one of them was in Portugal recently, very recently, just a fortnight ago. And those were at the confluence of AI and Industry 4.0. So, what is Industry 4.0? It is again a culmination of metaverse, AI, and probably human computer interaction and virtual reality. So, AI comes into the picture when it is used in tandem with the technologies, and metaverse is nothing but the coexistence of a universe which makes interaction with virtual reality even more intuitive in the long run. And it is again used in a way that it should facilitate the easy exchange of information between the virtual reality object and humans. Okay, so I think is a catalyst in the process of building a metaverse. It's a precursor to a fully functional metaverse, and it is to be used in tandem and in collaboration with all the stakeholders. Like, for example, in the paper that I recently published, we had a psychologist who was working on the DASS test. It is the depression, anxiety, stress test. So we tried to map human factors pertaining to the COVID-19 pandemic, and we took it in a way that it was based on the usage of head-mounted displays in one of the European countries, and what the industrial workers thought was the difference between how they felt without using the HMDs while working, and using the HMDs while working and not using the HMDs while working. So based on these two differences and how they felt amidst the pandemic, when the situation had changed, and the HMDs were used to relay real-time information from the factories to the workers by sitting at their home. So I think this is a very good example of how metaverse will change how things work. Okay, so you can not only just perceive something, but you are able to take a decision on that. You are able to take a decision sitting at the comfort of your zone, and obviously there are only certain parameters that can be changed remotely. You can't operate a fully functional industry or a factory or an assembly line remotely. But then this was again something which was done, and the results were very promising, especially in the automotive industry where there are a lot of hazards, operational hazards. Okay, so I think it answers a lot of questions, and this is how AI is actually shaping. It is being a catalyst, and it is being a precursor to a fully functional universe.
So let me, kind of, wrap my mind around this. So you are telling me that with AI, I can interact with the virtual universe being created, and AI is going to smoothen out that process for me, smoothen my experience. So I can also create virtual avatars and, to interact with the elements in the metaverse, right?
So, just to answer your question and to give one very anecdotal advice or anecdotal piece of information for your listeners, there's something called anthropomorphic avatars. People should search for this, and they should search why anthropomorphic avatars are so important. And there is something called andro-humanoid robots. So, when I was in Europe, I have come across robots which were so identical to a human that operationally they were obviously not up to terms or at par with how humans used to interact. But aesthetically and virtually, or you can say physically, virtually, virtual reality wise, they were so identical that you could definitely envision a future wherein we are not only able to work in tandem with AI, but AI is able to predict to an extent what the user's action would be. Okay, and it is not just about how the action was taken. Again, my second paper recently was on explainable AI and interpretable machine learning. So in that context, what we tried to do was, there was a data set of around 10,000 diabetic patients, I mean diabetic and non-diabetic patients. And what we did was, using ELI5, Shapely, and Lime frameworks, which are very much potent when it comes to XAI and interpretable machine learning, we tried to answer the question, the paramount question of why the artificial intelligence or the ML model arrived at a decision, why it was such that a particular patient was classified as diabetic or non-diabetic. So there's this accountability which is taking place, and moving forward, this accountability will play a very pivotal role when it comes to shaping content generation, and it will also be the pivotal pillars of AI based content generation and creating a metaverse where the machine is not only able to arrive at a decision but is able to explain the decision. So these are the things to look out for.
Okay, so this was quite fascinating. So let me kind of wrap my head around this. So you're saying that using AI is used to basically smoothen out my experience, how I access metaverse and how metaverse entities are created and rendered, so that I can interact with them easily, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Moving on to our next question. I mean, yeah, there is a lot of debate around, positives and negatives of AI, obviously. But with this content
Yeah.
generation and manipulation, since we are talking about China's, draft regulation, which kind of, tries to regulate all the aspects. I mean, it has clauses on text content generation and manipulation, music, voice, biometric features, and everything. Of course, it raises question that why this is being done. Can you tell us little about this, positive aspects and maybe some drawbacks of AI generated content?
Yeah, Mega. So definitely there are advantages and pitfalls to any technology that we make up. And content-based AI generation has been going on since a lot of years. So advantages when it comes to enlisting the advantages, the first most predominant advantage is that there's a lot of increase in sales because I can give you a very real life example. If you search for something like vegetable markets near me, it's a very generic query, and I think every one of us, or probably if you search for doctors near me or COVID, for example, COVID-19, if you search for COVID-19 self test kits, okay, so you might encounter that after a couple of hours. If you go on to any site, you start seeing ads related to COVID-19 self help kits to buy. Okay, so what the AI is actually doing, it is taking into consideration your prior search history, and based on those keywords it is trying to recommend you content which it thinks that might be helpful to you. Okay, and in a lot of business applications this is generating a lot of revenue. So the first benefit is that there has been a huge increase in the amount of the revenue generation that has been happening through content based recommendation system. Recommendation systems are very very important to generating revenues, because if you buy one particular, as I said earlier also, if you buy one particular item on Amazon, you definitely get two or three recommendations for, and it even explains why it gave you this recommendation, saying that people who bought this particular item also bought these particular items. And more often than not, we are compelled to buy, or we definitely buy it. For example, if you buy a smartphone, it gives you a suggestion that people also bought a tempered glass, okay, or back cover. So revenue generation is definitely happening due to content based AI generation. And when it comes to examples of, the second thing I would like to add is text and image generated generation using AI. Okay, so I'll give you a very real life case study which was done by me and my research colleagues some time ago. There was this bushfire in Australia. If you know, there was a huge loss of life and the vegetation due to the bushfire. So what we were tasked was that we were given some data samples from drone footage of that particular forest. Okay, and using deep learning itself, there's a subset, or there's a algorithm called generative adversarial networks, which is basically it tries to mimic an adversarial approach to deep learning. In short, I'll explain it to you. For example, if you have to chalk out apples and oranges out of a basket, so what will you do? If you want to choose apples, there are two techniques. You will choose apples and you will not choose oranges, right? So what you are trying to do is you are trying to select something and you are trying to ignore something. So in generative adversarial networks also, the same thing happens. There is a generator and there is a discriminator. So it one tries to work on classifying things in a way that it is useful, and the second one tries to ignore or just leave out the things or the elements which are not required for the output class. So similarly, image generation happens through deep learning. And the task that we were given was that there were some graffiti paintings which are done on walls by freelance artists mostly. And they have a lot of fires and vegetation sort of arts which resemble an actual fire. So we were given a task of identifying the actual bushfire images versus graffiti images, which are very similar in content or which are very similar visually. Okay. So image-based AI recommendation also happens in a way that it takes into account a particular image that is fed to the classifier, and based on that image, it is able to recommend you, for example, CCTV footage. If a law enforcement agency wants to identify a certain criminal who was probably passing through a certain terminal, based on a photograph that you have been given by that the law enforcement agency which receives the photograph, if it is given to a particular data scientist or a particular person who is in charge of that, who is in charge of that terminal, he's able to quickly identify all the CCTV camera footage. And based on certain feature vectors, again, this is very important. Feature vectors are basically elements which make up a certain image. So based on the example image that was given to him, it can quickly compare and see if that person passed a certain terminal. So this is, I think, image recognition or image recommendation at its best. It is used in law enforcement. It is used in content generation. And when it comes to using text-based generation using AI, as I said, Grammarly is a very, very potent example of text-based generation. Or even nowadays, you can see when you write something. For example, I am writing you an email. If I write, please find, the word attached comes as a recommendation. If you just press the button, you press tab, right? So what is happening is content is being generated implicitly based on some algorithms which were fed to the system, and text is getting generated based on certain phrases which have been given to the system. And when it comes to drawbacks, I think these were the advantages of AI. The drawbacks, I think they stem from a couple of things. First is the usage of information, like how much information should be used. And this has been one of the pitfalls of using this. And this is why the GDPR came in, the General Data Protection and Regulation, that to be able to generate content using AI, what is most paramount is labeled data. Okay. Labeling of data, like the system should be able to identify which things to classify and which things to leave out. For that, we need labeled data. And when it comes to fetching labeled data, you have to sort of encroach upon the user's data in a way that it is like there was this scandal when it came to data regulation. All the CEOs were summoned by the US Congress Senate Committee on Data, on Science and Technology. And if you if you just watch those videos on YouTube, there is this whole the charade about how much data is being used and what part of the user's data is being used. So the first pitfall is about privacy, how much data should be used and what to leave out. And the second thing, that second example that I can give about is give you about is Cambridge Analytica's scandal in the 2016 US election. So based on certain parameters or based on certain political affiliations or political inclinations, people were sort of indirectly motivated or sort of indirectly, uh, recommendations that influence the decision making. So I think the pitfalls are about privacy, how much data is being used. Secondly, there is one more thing called biased classification. Okay. For example, if I am searching for oranges, so, or if I search just for the umbrella term orange, orange can mean a color, orange can mean a fruit, orange can be a company, because there's a company in France called Orange, INC. So, how does the AI differentiate between these three things? And the AI is not currently at a level where it is able to relate. Now, based on prior search history, it will definitely recommend you a fruit. For example, if you have searched in the past about fruits, but what if at that particular juncture, you want to search about the orange company and not the orange fruit? Okay. So this is also pitfall that it's called biased recommendation. So the recommendations are biased. The content generation is not up to the mark. And secondly, there's a lot of issue with regards to privacy and data regulation and preservation and everything. So these are the pitfalls of AI based content recommendation.
Okay, so this was quite enlightening actually, and perhaps this is also a reason you can see this in why this Chinese government has brought out these regulations, because for exactly this reason, data privacy, personal security, and biased kind of recommendations, biased kind of content creation, rather. These kind of concerns are behind
Exactly.
regulation. So yeah, we'll talk more about
Exactly.
this regulation and. China's draft regulation later.
Yeah, thanks, Megha. Before we move on to the next question, let's take a quick commercial break.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus Says, the cast and crew of Gerhaya joins Cyrus in a fun chat about the making of the film. Cyrus talks to Deepika Padukone, Ananya Pandey, Siddhant Chaturvedi, Darya Karwa, and the director Shakun Batra. Kadai podcast is back with a new story. When Well Seni is a Tamil podcast done by Kavita Jiva. Find out how Tamil South India stayed independent of Ashoka and the Mauryan Empire. On Paisa West, Anupam discusses finance for informal labor with Gautam Bharadwaj and Parul Sheth Khanna, co-founders and directors at Pinbox Solutions. Should assisted dying and euthanasia be legalized? On All Things Policy, the Takshashila folk analyze the Lancet Commission's Value of Death report. And on the Filter Coffee podcast with Karthik Nagarajan, freelance journalist Priyanka Pula sheds light on the drug regulation problems in India. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. The word of mouth really helps. Also, don't forget to rate us on whatever platform you're listening to us and check us out on YouTube. You can check a list of all of our channels at ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Bank of Baroda and HDFC Life Insurance. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome back. We are discussing synthetic content generation using AI and Chinese government's recent draft to regulate such content. So, Megha, are there any military applications of AI content generation, especially with regard to China and the rest of the world?
I think this one phenomenon which everybody knows. It's called deep fakes. It has been quite in news for a quite lot of time now. So deep fakes are essentially artificially generated images or edited images. It seem like real images or real type of text. So if you have to talk about military applications, you also need to talk about deep fakes first, because these type of content can be used to instill political instability or any personal purposes also. Now in my weekly newsletter I have covered one article where I had talked about some applications of deepfakes and its importance for national security. There is another application which kind of relates to military and national security. It's about metaverse. So a few days ago, there's an article in PLA Daily which talked about the battlefield metaverse. Essentially, I mean, we are talking a lot about metaverse these days. You can see a lot of articles and a lot of CEO and technology companies talking about metaverse. It is essentially a virtual environment. So this article in PLA Daily talked about a virtual environment explicitly for military purposes. Now, to create this metaverse, you need AI and deep learning. You need synthetically generated content like artificial music and avatars, and you need some kind of technology that can convert your gestures to actions which your avatars make in this virtual metaverse. So intent of this battlefield metaverse was to train, simulate battlefield scenarios, to train people to emulate how weapons will work out, or to emulate how different scenarios will work out, to assist in decision making. But it was very interesting to know that PLA writers are actually thinking about creating an explicit metaverse for military itself. And for that, again, the synthetically generated content is very, very important. And from that perspective, if you see these guidelines, it makes sense that Chinese government would like to have some control, or some kind of control over what kind of content is being generated and who is doing that.
Thanks, Megha. That's very precise. So, what are the key takeaways for India from this? What do we know about India's use of AI and quantum technologies in the defense sector?
Suyash, till now, we generally relied on National Technical Research Organization, that is NTRO, for cyber or aerospace or those kind of operations. But in 2018, Prime Minister Narendra Modi approved creation of a dedicated cyber command, aerospace command, and a special operations command during a conference in Jodhpur. India also established a defense cyber agency in 2018 to handle cybersecurity threats. But this is, evolving kind of operations in India. And we still don't have a lot of information on what is India's approach. And how these things are going to be organized. Since this is an evolving space, of course, we need to look into it and we need to keep track of it. But apart from that, I think we also need to kind of, look into how this AI and, artificially generated content can be used into military. We need more research on this. We need to more India originated research on these topics. Because when it comes to military, it's always better if research is indigenous. And now, since now a lot of many countries are being sensitive about which kind of technologies they are researching on, we should have some focus on AI and quantum.
As you have rightly pointed out, Megha, this is a really interesting sphere to be in, and I'm sure researchers like you at Takshashila would surely deeply follow what's happening in this space in the future. That's it for today, folks. Do check out Megha's newsletter, China Tech Dispatch. We will share a link in the description below.
Also, a lot of thanks to Varad for joining this episode. Do check out his papers, and I'll share links to some of his work in the description. Thank you so much, Varad, for coming.
Thank you, Megha, and wishing all who are interested in AI a very happy journey when it comes to their careers and curiosity. Keep up the great work, and we'll definitely join some other day. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm very grateful to you and your team.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good day.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
We face 100 dilemmas every day while raising our children and nurturing our families. Why not let science help us make informed decisions to solve our dilemmas? Hi, I'm Devi Shobha.
And I'm Meghna. We host Big Talk About Tiny Humans, where we will help you unpack challenges around parenting and your child's development.
And more importantly, we will equip you with research-backed strategies that you can readily act on.
Tune in to our podcast every Wednesday on the IBM Podcasts app, website, or your favorite podcast platforms.
Don't you think that if everyone around you is getting smart, you better be smarter? Hey there, I'm the traveling professor Siddharth Deshmukh, and I'm back with season 2 of my podcast to make you smarter. Smarter with Sid. What's this season's focus about? Well, it's about 10-minute nuggets that will make you stand out at work. It's time to go from smart to smarter. Tune in every Tuesday and Thursday and become smarter with Sid.